So I'm standing here today at Old Fort Niagara and Fort Niagara State Park in Western New York, along the western end of Lake Ontario, and where the Niagara River cuts in south of here to go down towards Lake Erie and then into other parts of the rest of the country to the south of here. As late as the late 1600s, this was the location of a French trading post. It would have been a very simple, primitive, probably log cabin, impermanent structures. A couple of these trading posts came and went in the late 1600s until the 1720s, when this permanent structure becomes the first European-style building built on this defensive point here. This, what's become known as the French Castle, is a heavily fortified three-story building with heavy shutters that can be closed, and it has its own well inside it. And there were separate rooms for enlisted men, officers, storage, and importantly a trading area where they might trade goods with the local population of natives that lived in the area. This becomes an important part of the French defense of their route along Lake Ontario, which would take them from here to the eastern end of the lake, where present-day Fort Ontario is, Fort Oswego was back then, and then up the St. Lawrence River to Quebec and Montreal, and then out into the Atlantic Ocean. So again, part of this super highway of the 18th century that allowed both Europeans and natives to trade and move settlers and military forces along these rivers and waterways. So to that point, in 1759, in the early spring, a group of about 3,000 British step off from Long Island, move up the Hudson Valley to the Mohawk, eventually making their way. They lay quick siege to the French force that isn't well defended at what is present day called Fort Ontario, near present-day Oswego, and then use that as a jumping off point to go to leapfrog down along the shore, stopping in Irondequoit Bay, just east of current-day Rochester, in and around Rochester, and eventually landing down here just a little bit east of the fort, and begin establishing these siege constructions, which are kind of in the distance here and are being demonstrated today during a reenactment that's going on. So that British force lands here in early July, late June of 1759, begins their siege, becomes a classic kind of siege of that era, with digging trenches and moving cannon closer and closer. And this fort was nothing like this nowadays. It would have been a wooden palisaded wall. These brick walls are later Civil War era construction, as are some of these other buildings are built more like around after the French and Indian War, these other stone buildings. In 1759, in July, that siege takes place. In early July, a French force on the 24th attempts to relieve the siege, moving up from the south. They're surprised at an area that's called now the Battle of La Belle Famille, and then 2 days after their loss there, the French that are in the fort here finally capitulate, and this becomes a British fort for the remainder of the French and Indian War, effectively locking down this whole superhighway of rivers and waterways and lakes, become British owned, and allows them to cut off the French and eventually win what becomes known as the French and Indian War. So it's a fantastic location. It's being considered as a National Park Service site. It does play, as I mentioned, into American Revolution history, Civil War history, War of 1812 history. It was a German POW camp in the 40s. So there's a ton of history here. It's a beautiful site on a July day like this, overlooking Lake Ontario, and there's a large reenactment going on, which we're glad to have back after several years of it having been away. Well worth the trip as a tourist site. It's an incredible example of a couple hundred years of fort development, and in particular this 1720s era French building is a really remarkable piece of fort building to visit, particularly for that period.